The sun was bright that Tuesday afternoon as 12-year-old Andrew stood by the big windows at Bay Ridge Regional Airport. His eyes were glued to the planes taking off and landing, their engines roaring as they climbed into the clear blue sky. He clutched his worn notebook tightly, the pages already filled with careful drawings of different aircraft he had spotted over the past hour. "That's a Boeing 737-800, he whispered to himself, quickly sketching the outline of the plane that had just pulled up to a gate. He added notes about its winglets and engine type, just like his dad had taught him. Aviation wasn't just a hobby for Andrew, it was his whole world. His bedroom walls were covered with airplane posters, and he could name almost every commercial aircraft model just by looking at its silhouette. Andrew's mom had dropped him off at the public viewing area while she ran to the pharmacy and grocery store nearby. "I'll be back in 2 hours," she had told him. "Stay in the main terminal area where there are plenty of people and don't wander off." Andrew had nodded seriously, promising to follow her rules. At 12, he felt grown up enough to handle himself for a short time. As he moved to a different window to get a better view of a small regional jet taxiing toward the runway, Andrew didn't notice the airline pilot watching him from across the terminal. Captain Thomas Wilson had just finished his pre-flight checks and was heading to the crew lounge when he spotted the young black boy moving slowly through the terminal, writing in a notebook and studying the planes outside. Wilson frowned. Something about the boy's behavior seemed odd to him. Why was a kid alone in an airport, taking notes about aircraft? In Wilson's mind, airport security was a serious matter. After 20 years of flying commercial jets, he had seen security measures tighten dramatically. The boy probably had an innocent explanation, but what if he didn't? Andrew smiled as he watched ground crew load luggage onto a plane. He imagined himself as a pilot someday, sitting in the cockpit with all those controls at his fingertips. His dad often told him stories about famous black pilots like Bessie Coleman and Eugene Bullard, reminding Andrew that the sky was open to everyone with the determination to reach it. One day, Andrew thought, "That'll be me up there." Meanwhile, Captain Wilson had approached a security guard stationed near the terminal entrance. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice low. "I've been watching that boy over there for the past 15 minutes. He's alone and taking notes about the planes. In today's world, we can't be too careful." The security guard, a middle-aged woman named Officer Rivera, looked toward where Wilson was pointing. "The kid with the blue jacket? He looks like he's just interested in the planes." "Maybe," Wilson admitted, "but he's been moving around to different windows, writing things down. No parents in sight. Don't you think that's worth checking out?" Officer Rivera hesitated. The boy didn't look like he was doing anything wrong, just a kid fascinated by airplanes. But the pilot seemed genuinely concerned, and airport protocol required her to follow up on all reported suspicious behavior. "I'll go talk to him," she finally said. As Officer Rivera walked toward Andrew, the boy was completely lost in his observations, counting the windows on a passing Airbus A320. He didn't notice her approach until she was standing right beside him. "Hello there," she said with a practiced smile. "Are you waiting for someone?" Andrew looked up, startled. His heart jumped a little at the sight of the security uniform. Had he done something wrong? "My mom dropped me off," he explained, his voice suddenly smaller than before. "She's coming back in about an hour. I'm just watching the planes." Officer Rivera nodded and pointed to his notebook. "And what's that you're writing?" Andrew opened his notebook to show her his drawings. "I'm keeping track of all the different planes I see. This one's a Boeing, and that one over there is an Airbus. I want to be a pilot when I grow up." Before Officer Rivera could respond, Captain Wilson appeared beside her. He glanced at the notebook, his expression still suspicious. "Where exactly is your mother?" he asked Andrew, his tone much sterner than the security officers had been. "And why would she leave you alone in an airport?" Andrew's excitement about the planes suddenly vanished, replaced by a creeping feeling that he was in trouble. The pilot's questions made him feel like he'd done something terribly wrong, though he couldn't figure out what. He didn't know it yet, but the worst was still to come. Andrew's hands trembled slightly as he held open his notebook. The drawings he had been so proud of just minutes ago now felt like evidence of some crime he didn't understand. Officer Rivera studied the detailed sketches of planes, her expression softening as she recognized the innocent enthusiasm behind them. "These are really good," she said, turning a page to see more of his work. "You've got quite an eye for detail." Captain Wilson crossed his arms, unmoved by the boy's artwork. "That doesn't explain why he's alone in an airport taking notes on aircraft," he said. His voice was low but firm, intended for Officer Rivera, but loud enough for Andrew to hear. "In today's world, we need to be extra careful about unusual behavior in airports." Andrew's throat felt tight. He glanced around, hoping to spot his mom returning early, but saw only strangers rushing to their gates or waiting in line at coffee shops. "My mom just went to get medicine and groceries," Andrew explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "She said I could stay here and watch the planes. I'm not doing anything wrong." He closed his notebook and held it against his chest like a shield. Officer Rivera placed a gentle hand on Andrew's shoulder. "I'm sure you're not, honey, but we do need to call your parents. Do you have your mom's phone number?" Andrew nodded and recited his mother's cell number. As Officer Rivera pulled out her phone, Captain Wilson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We should also call the police," he muttered. "Even if the kid is innocent, someone needs to explain to his parents that leaving a child alone in an airport isn't acceptable." Officer Rivera hesitated, her finger hovering over her phone screen. "Let me talk to his mother first. This might just be a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Wilson repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What kind of parent leaves their kid alone in an airport to take notes on planes? Best case scenario, it's neglect. Worst case." He left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was clear. Andrew felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment as nearby travelers began to glance over at the commotion. A knot formed in his stomach as he realized this wasn't going to be resolved quickly. "My dad works with airplanes," he said quietly, hoping this information might help. "He knows I'm here. He said it's okay as long as I stay in the public areas." Captain Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Your dad works with planes? Doing what exactly?" Before Andrew could answer, Officer Rivera stepped aside, speaking into her phone. Andrew could hear her explaining the situation, but his mom wasn't answering. The call went to voicemail. "She's probably driving," Andrew offered. "She doesn't answer when she's driving." Officer Rivera nodded, but Captain Wilson was already flagging down another security officer who was walking past. "We've got an unaccompanied minor who's been taking notes on aircraft," Wilson explained to the new officer, a tall man with a serious expression. "His mother apparently left him here alone, and we can't reach her. I think we need to escalate this." The second officer looked Andrew up and down, then nodded. "I'll call it in. Better safe than sorry." Andrew's heart sank. He had been so excited about spending time watching planes, and now he was in trouble. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back, not wanting to cry in front of all these strangers. "Can I call my dad?" he asked, his voice small against the busy sounds of the terminal. "He can explain everything." Officer Rivera looked sympathetic, but Captain Wilson shook his head. "Let's let the police handle this properly when they arrive. They'll need to verify any contacts." The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Andrew waited, standing awkwardly between the two security officers while Captain Wilson kept glancing at his watch, clearly concerned about his own schedule. Several travelers slowed as they passed, curious about what was happening. Andrew felt like an animal in a zoo, being stared at by everyone who walked by. He clutched his notebook tighter, wishing he could disappear. When two police officers finally entered the terminal, walking purposefully toward their little group, Andrew felt his stomach drop. This was really happening. They were calling the police on him just for looking at airplanes. The first officer, a stocky man with a buzz cut, approached with his hand resting casually on his belt. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, looking between the adults before his gaze settled on Andrew. Andrew stared at the floor, his passion for aviation momentarily forgotten as fear washed over him. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: his simple trip to watch planes had turned into something he never could have imagined. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered what would happen when they discovered exactly who his father was. The two police officers towered over Andrew as he stood clutching his notebook. One officer, whose nameplate read Officer Chen, knelt down to Andrew's level while the other remained standing, surveying the small crowd that had gathered nearby. "Hey there, buddy," Officer Chen said, his voice gentler than Andrew had expected. "Can you tell me your name and what's going on today?" Andrew swallowed hard. My name is Andrew Taylor. I was just watching the planes and drawing them in my notebook. My mom dropped me off while she went to get some medicine and groceries. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. Captain Wilson stepped forward before Andrew could continue. I noticed him wandering around the terminal for over an hour, officer. He's been taking detailed notes about the aircraft, types, locations, movements. Given the security concerns at airports these days, I felt it was necessary to alert security. Officer Chen nodded but kept his focus on Andrew. Can I see your notebook? Andrew handed it over, watching anxiously as the officer flipped through pages filled with carefully drawn planes, notes about their models, and timestamps of takeoffs and landings. The second officer, a woman with short brown hair, leaned over to look at the notebook. You're quite the artist, she said with a small smile. How old are you, Andrew? 12, he replied. I'll be 13 next month. Captain Wilson made an impatient noise. Regardless of his talent, an unaccompanied minor shouldn't be left alone in an airport taking notes on aircraft. It's a security risk, and frankly, it's irresponsible parenting. Several onlookers murmured in agreement, while others frowned at the pilot's harsh tone. Andrew felt his face flush with shame. He hadn't meant to cause trouble or make anyone worry about security. He just loved planes. Do you have a phone number for your parents? Officer Chen asked, handing the notebook back to Andrew. I tried calling his mother, Officer Rivera interjected. No answer. He says she's driving. What about your father? The female officer asked. Can we call him? Andrew nodded quickly. My dad's phone number is in my contacts. He pulled a small phone from his pocket and scrolled through until he found his father's number. The female officer took down the information. My dad works with airplanes, Andrew added, hoping this might help his case. He lets me come watch them sometimes. Oh yeah? Officer Chen asked, maintaining a conversational tone. What does he do with airplanes? Andrew opened his mouth to answer but was interrupted as the female officer stepped away to make the call. Captain Wilson checked his watch impatiently. I need to prepare for my flight, he said to Officer Rivera. Will you need anything else from me? Officer Rivera shook her head. We have your statement. The police can handle it from here. As Captain Wilson turned to leave, Andrew felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. The situation seemed to be calming down, but he was still surrounded by security and police in the middle of a busy airport. It's ringing, the female officer said, holding her phone to her ear. After a moment, her expression changed subtly. Yes, hello. This is Officer Garcia with the Bay Ridge Airport Police. I'm calling about your son, Andrew. Andrew couldn't hear his father's response, but Officer Garcia's professional demeanor shifted slightly. She stood a little straighter and her tone became more formal. Yes, sir, he's fine. He was observed taking notes about aircraft in the terminal, and it raised some security concerns with airport personnel. She paused, listening. Yes, he's right here. No, he's not in any trouble. Another pause, longer this time. Andrew watched as Officer Garcia's eyes widened slightly. I see. I wasn't aware of that, sir. She glanced at Andrew with new interest. Yes, of course. We'll wait right here. Officer Chen raised an eyebrow questioningly as Officer Garcia ended the call. She took a breath before addressing everyone. Andrew's father is on his way. He was actually already heading to the airport for a meeting. She hesitated, then added, he asked us to make sure his son is comfortable while we wait. So everything's okay? Andrew asked hopefully. Officer Garcia nodded. Your dad will be here soon. He sounds very concerned about the situation. Something in her tone made Andrew relax slightly. He knew that voice. It was the sound of an adult suddenly realizing they might have misjudged something important. He'd heard that tone before when teachers or other grown-ups discovered who his father was. The small crowd began to disperse now that the excitement seemed to be over. Captain Wilson had already disappeared toward the boarding gates, but Officer Rivera remained, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Do you want something to drink while we wait? Officer Chen asked. There's a water fountain just over there. Andrew shook his head. He wasn't thirsty. He was too busy wondering what would happen when his father arrived. He didn't have to wait long to find out. The airport's main entrance doors slid open, letting in a blast of warm air and a man dressed in a sharp navy suit. Andra spotted him immediately and felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Dad," he called out, his voice breaking slightly. Dr. Raymond Taylor strode purposefully across the terminal, his presence commanding attention even before anyone knew who he was. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and a serious expression, he naturally drew eyes. But it was the confidence in his walk and the authority in his gaze that made people step aside as he approached. Officer Garcia straightened her posture and stepped forward. "Mr. Taylor, I'm Officer Garcia. We spoke on the phone." "It's Dr. Taylor," he corrected firmly but not unkindly. He placed a protective hand on Andra's shoulder. "Are you all right, son?" Andra nodded, suddenly feeling much braver with his father beside him. "I was just watching the planes like you said I could, Dad. I didn't do anything wrong." Dr. Taylor surveyed the group of uniformed personnel surrounding his son. "I'd like to understand exactly what happened here," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Why were the police called on my 12-year-old son?" Officer Chen stepped forward. "Sir, one of the airline pilots reported concerns about a minor alone in the airport taking notes about aircraft. Given airport security protocols." "I'm well aware of airport security protocols, officer," Dr. Taylor interrupted. "In fact, I help write them." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the officer's face. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Dr. Taylor reached into his suit jacket and pulled out an identification card with the Federal Aviation Administration seal prominently displayed. "I'm Dr. Raymond Taylor, Regional Administrator for the Federal Aviation Administration. My son was in this public terminal with my full knowledge and permission, pursuing his interest in aviation." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Officer Rivera's eyes widened in recognition, and several nearby passengers who had been pretending not to listen suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Officer Garcia cleared her throat. "Dr. Taylor, we weren't aware of your position. The report came from a pilot who was concerned about security." "And this pilot is where now?" Dr. Taylor asked, looking around. "He had to prepare for his flight," Officer Rivera said, her voice much quieter than before. "Captain Wilson is with Bay Coast Airlines." Dr. Taylor nodded slowly, taking in this information. "I see. And did Captain Wilson explain why exactly he found my son's presence threatening? Was my son in a restricted area?" "No, sir," Officer Chen admitted. "He was in the public viewing area." "Was he bothering other passengers?" "No, sir." "Was he doing anything besides sitting quietly and taking notes about planes in a notebook?" The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Andra watched his father with admiration. He'd seen his dad in professional mode before, but never quite like this. "The concern was that he was alone and taking detailed notes about aircraft," Officer Garcia explained. "Captain Wilson felt it was suspicious behavior." Dr. Taylor's expression hardened slightly. "My son has been an aviation enthusiast since he was 5 years old. I've encouraged his interest because someday he might follow in my footsteps. What I'm hearing is that my son was reported as suspicious for being a young black boy alone in an airport with a notebook." The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say. Andra felt a complex mix of emotions, pride in his father, lingering embarrassment from the ordeal, but also a growing awareness of what had really happened today. It wasn't about his notebook or being alone. It was about who he was and how people saw him. "Andra has my wife's maiden name," Dr. Taylor continued, his voice quieter now. "If his last name were Taylor, would Captain Wilson have made the same assumptions? If he were a different color, would we be having this conversation at all?" Officer Chen had the decency to look genuinely troubled by these questions. "Sir, I can't speak to the pilot's motivations, but I apologize for any distress this has caused your son." Dr. Taylor nodded curtly. "I appreciate that, officer. Now, I'd like the name of Captain Wilson's supervisor and the details of his flight today." He turned to Andra. "And for the record, son, I'm incredibly proud of your interest in aviation. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong in an airport or anywhere else." Andra stood a little taller at his father's words. The fear and shame that had been building inside him began to fade, replaced by something stronger, a sense that what had happened wasn't right, and his father wasn't going to let it slide. The real story was just beginning. The airport's administrative office was quieter than the busy terminal, but the tension in the room made it feel just as crowded. Dr. Taylor sat straight-backed in a chair across from the airport's operations manager, a nervous-looking man named Mr. Patel who had been called in specifically to handle the situation. Andrew sat beside his father, still clutching his notebook. "I've contacted Bay Coast Airlines," Mr. Patel said, his fingers tapping anxiously on his desk. "Captain Wilson's flight has been delayed for mechanical issues, so he should be joining us shortly." Dr. Taylor nodded. "Good. I want to address this directly." Andrew looked up at his father, admiring how calm he seemed. Inside, Andrew was still a jumble of emotions: embarrassment from being treated like a criminal, relief that his dad had come, and a growing anger as he understood what had really happened to him. "Dad," he whispered, "do I have to be here when the pilot comes? Can I wait outside?" Dr. Taylor's stern expression softened as he looked at his son. "You don't have to stay if you don't want to, Andrew. But sometimes it's important to face people who've wronged you. It shows them you're not afraid." Andrew thought about this. He didn't feel brave, but his dad's words made sense. "I'll stay," he decided. The door opened and Officer Garcia stepped in. "Captain Wilson is here, sir." Captain Wilson entered the room with the confident stride of someone used to being in charge. That confidence faltered slightly when he saw Dr. Taylor and the official FAA credentials sitting prominently on the desk. His eyes darted to Andrew, then back to the adults in the room. "I understand there's some concern about a report I made," Wilson said, his tone professional but guarded. "I was simply following security protocols." Dr. Taylor stood up, extending his hand. "Dr. Raymond Taylor, Regional Administrator for the Federal Aviation Administration. This is my son, Andrew." Wilson shook his hand, his expression revealing a flash of recognition at the title. "Captain Thomas Wilson. I wasn't aware of your connection to the boy." "Obviously," Dr. Taylor replied dryly. "Please have a seat. I'd like to understand exactly what suspicious behavior my son was exhibiting that warranted calling security and the police." Wilson sat down, straightening his uniform tie. "Dr. Taylor, with all due respect, I observed an unaccompanied minor wandering the terminal taking detailed notes about aircraft. In today's security environment, that raised concerns." "My son was sitting in a public viewing area, Captain Wilson. He wasn't wandering," Dr. Taylor corrected. "And he was taking notes because he loves aviation and wants to be a pilot someday. Just like you." Andrew watched the pilot's face, wondering if his father's words were having any effect. Wilson glanced at him briefly before responding. "I understand that now, but at the time, I had no way of knowing his intentions. We're trained to report unusual behavior. Is it unusual for a child to be interested in planes at an airport?" Dr. Taylor asked, his voice still calm, but with an edge that made everyone in the room sit straighter. "Or was it unusual to see a young black boy with a notebook? Would you have made the same report if Andrew were white?" The bluntness of the question hung in the air. Captain Wilson's face flushed. "This has nothing to do with race," he insisted. "I would have reported any unaccompanied minor behaving the same way." Mr. Patel cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should focus on how to resolve this situation." "I agree," Dr. Taylor said. "And resolution begins with acknowledgement. Captain Wilson, you made an assumption about my son based on how he looks. That assumption led to him being treated like a security threat, questioned by police, and humiliated in front of dozens of travelers." Andrew felt a surge of pride hearing his father speak so directly. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt like someone was truly seeing what had happened to him. "What do you want from me, Dr. Taylor?" Wilson asked, his voice tighter than before. "I want you to look at my son and consider what this experience taught him about how the world sees him," Dr. Taylor said. "Andrew came here today excited about planes and aviation. He left learning that some people will always see him as suspicious, no matter what he's actually doing." Andrew looked directly at Captain Wilson for the first time since he'd entered the room. The pilot met his gaze briefly before looking away. "I'm sorry if I misinterpreted the situation," Wilson said, though his words carried more resignation than genuine remorse. "That wasn't my intention." Dr. Taylor's expression made it clear he found the apology lacking, but before he could respond, Andrew spoke up. I just want to know, he said, his voice smaller but steadier than he expected. What about me made you think I was dangerous? Captain Wilson's face went through a series of emotions, surprise, discomfort, and something that might have been shame, as he struggled to answer Andrew's simple question. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone in the room. I was just following protocol, Wilson finally said, his eyes fixed on the table rather than meeting Andrew's gaze. That's not an answer, Dr. Taylor said quietly. My son asked you a direct question. What made you think he was dangerous? Wilson shifted in his seat. Look, I don't. He stopped, took a breath, and seemed to make a decision. Maybe I did jump to conclusions. I saw a kid alone, taking notes, and I thought the worst instead of the most likely explanation. Andrew nodded slowly, processing the closest thing to honesty the pilot had offered so far. Mr. Patel cleared his throat. Captain Wilson, Bay Coast Airlines has strict policies about discrimination and racial profiling. This incident will need to be reported to your supervisors. You're going to report me? Wilson's professional demeanor cracked slightly. I was trying to keep the airport safe. By reporting a 12-year-old boy who was sitting quietly in a public area, Dr. Taylor asked. That doesn't make anyone safer, Captain. That just makes black children feel unwelcome in public spaces. Before Wilson could respond, the door opened and a woman rushed in, her eyes immediately finding Andra. Andra, are you okay? She hurried to his side, pulling him into a quick hug before turning to face the others. I'm Lisa Taylor, Andra's mother. I got your messages when I finished shopping. What is going on here? Dr. Taylor touched his wife's arm gently. Lisa, Captain Wilson here called security because he thought Andrew was suspicious for watching planes and taking notes. Mrs. Taylor's expression hardened as she looked at the pilot. You called security on my son for being interested in aviation? In an airport? Wilson looked increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment. Mrs. Taylor, I understand you're upset, but... Upset doesn't begin to cover it, she interrupted. Do you have any idea what could have happened? Every week we see news stories about situations like this going terribly wrong. The room fell silent again. No one needed her to elaborate further. What happens now? Andrew asked, looking between his parents. Dr. Taylor placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Now we make sure this doesn't happen to another child. He turned to Mr. Patel. I'll be filing a formal complaint with Bay Coast Airlines, and I'll be reviewing security protocols at this airport in my official capacity. Mr. Patel nodded quickly. Of course, Dr. Taylor. We take this very seriously. Captain Wilson stood up. If we're done here, my flight. Your flight has been reassigned to another pilot, Mr. Patel said. Bay Coast Airlines has requested you return to headquarters for a meeting with HR and management. Wilson's face paled. You can't be serious. Over this? Over racial profiling that led to police being called on a minor. Yes, Captain, they're very serious, Mr. Patel confirmed. Wilson gathered his things, a mixture of anger and worry now plain on his face. He paused at the door, looking back at Andrew and his parents. For a moment, it seemed he might say something more, but then he simply left, the door closing firmly behind him. Mrs. Taylor wrapped her arm around Andrew. I'm so sorry this happened, honey. I should never have left you alone. It's not your fault, Mom, Andrew said. And I'm okay. You were okay, Dr. Taylor agreed. But what happened today wasn't okay, and we're going to make sure people know about it. Mr. Patel looked nervous again. Dr. Taylor, perhaps we can handle this quietly. Quietly is how these things continue to happen, Dr. Taylor said firmly. No, Mr. Patel. This isn't going to be quiet. Bay Coast Airlines and this airport need to take a hard look at their training and their culture. As they left the office, Andrew felt drained, but somehow taller than when he entered. His dad hadn't yelled or threatened. He'd simply spoken the truth and insisted that everyone face it. In the car ride home, Andrew was mostly quiet, looking out the window and thinking. His passion for planes hadn't diminished, but something had changed inside him. He understood now that the world wasn't always fair, but also that there were ways to stand up against unfairness. Dad, he finally said as they neared home. Yes, son. I still want to be a pilot someday. Andrew held his notebook a little tighter. Maybe even more now. Dr. Taylor smiled at him in the rearview mirror. Then that's exactly what you'll be, and you'll be an even better one than Captain Wilson. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, Andrew smiled too. 3 months passed since that day at the airport. The leaves had changed color and fallen, and the air had grown crisp with the promise of winter. Andrew sat at his desk in his bedroom, putting the final touches on a model airplane he'd been building. His walls were still covered with aviation posters, but now there was something new among them, a framed letter from Bay Coast Airlines. The doorbell rang, and Andrew heard his father's footsteps followed by voices downstairs. He wasn't expecting anyone, but curiosity pulled him from his room. As he reached the top of the stairs, he froze. Standing in the entryway with his father was Captain Wilson. The pilot looked different out of uniform, more ordinary in jeans and a button-down shirt. He seemed uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he spoke quietly with Dr. Taylor. "Andrew," his father called, noticing him on the stairs. "Could you come down, please?" Andrew descended slowly, his heart pounding. He hadn't seen the pilot since that day in the airport office. What could he possibly want now? "Hello, Andrew," Captain Wilson said, his voice softer than Andrew remembered. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Andrew glanced at his father, confused. He hadn't agreed to anything. "Captain Wilson called last week," Dr. Taylor explained. "He'd asked if he could speak with us. I thought it might be good for you to hear what he has to say." Andrew nodded, still wary but curious. They moved to the living room, where his mother already sat, her expression carefully neutral. Captain Wilson remained standing, even after everyone else had taken a seat. "I've spent the last 3 months in diversity training and suspension from flight duties," he began. "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that day at the airport." The room was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "The airline investigation concluded that I violated company policy," Wilson continued. "But more importantly, I violated something more basic. I judged someone based on assumptions instead of facts." He looked directly at Andrew now. "I owe you a real apology. Not the half-hearted one I gave in that office, but a genuine one." Andrew sat up straighter, surprised by the direct address. "I'm sorry, Andrew. What I did was wrong. I saw a young black boy alone in an airport and jumped to the worst conclusion instead of the most obvious one, that you were just a kid who loves planes." Wilson's voice had lost its defensive edge from 3 months ago. "There's no excuse for what I did. I can only tell you that I'm working to be better." The silence that followed felt heavy with months of hurt and reflection. Andrew looked to his parents, unsure how to respond. "I believe people can change," Dr. Taylor said finally. "But words are just the beginning." Wilson nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here with more than words." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for Andrew." Andrew accepted the envelope cautiously and opened it. Inside was a certificate for the Bay Coast Young Aviators Program, an exclusive mentorship opportunity that paired aspiring pilots with professionals. "It's a 6-week summer program," Wilson explained. "You'll get flight simulator time, behind-the-scenes airport tours, and mentorship from working pilots, including me, if you're willing." Andrew looked up in surprise. "You want to be my mentor?" "Only if you're comfortable with that," Wilson said. "The program director is an old friend of mine. When I told him about you and your interest in aviation, he agreed to hold a spot, but your parents and I thought the choice should be yours." Andrew ran his fingers over the embossed certificate. 3 months ago, this man had seen him as a threat. Now he was offering him an opportunity most kids could only dream about. "Why?" Andrew asked simply. Wilson took a deep breath. "Because what happened that day changed me. It forced me to see biases I didn't want to admit I had. And because talent should be nurtured, not discouraged." Andrew looked to his parents. His mother's cautious expression had softened slightly, and his father gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "I'd like to try the program," Andrew decided. "I can't promise about the mentorship part yet, though." Wilson nodded, accepting the boundary. "That's fair. The spot is yours regardless." As Captain Wilson prepared to leave, Andrew noticed something different in how the pilot looked at him now, with respect rather than suspicion. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a beginning. "You know," Wilson said at the door, The aviation world needs more people who notice details and care enough to write them down. Your notebook showed real passion. Don't lose that. After he left, Andrew stood with his parents in the quiet house, certificate still in hand. You don't have to accept if you don't want to, his mother assured him. Andrew shook his head. No, I want to. Not for him, but for me. He looked down at the certificate again. Besides, he was right about one thing. I do notice details. Maybe someday that'll make me a good pilot. The best, his father said, placing a hand on his shoulder. The very best.